Hi everyone, welcome to our Zoom event, Poetry in a Pandemic. I'm Jackie, I'm at home in my kitchen on the near the west coast of Wales, and over there, I think he's over that side, is Dave, who's in his front room, also in southwest Wales. Together we run the Cellar Bards spoken word event in Cardigan, which we've been doing for about 4 years now. The event itself has been running for 8, so it's quite a well-established event here in West Wales, in Cardigan. And I was just wanting to kick off with that really, and kick off with a bit of chat about spoken word. And I was just going to ask Dave, how important would you say that events like this are in your writing life?
In my writing life, yes, they are important in the sense that I often write with a live audience in mind, and I quite enjoy the entertainment value of poetry. But I have written poetry for a very long time. I mean, probably more than 45 years. And for probably about 30 years, I didn't even show a single poem to anybody. And then suddenly when Poems and Pints at the Queen's in Carmarthen started, I think that was in 2010, that was a great opportunity to read poetry live. I mean, I had read a bit live before in pubs in Somerset, for example, and got a good response. But yes, delivering poetry to a live audience is pretty important to me, but it's not the be-all and end-all of poetry.
Why would you say it's so important?
Because you have a direct communication line with your audience. So you can produce a book and it goes out to people, and in a way, unless you directly ask your readers for feedback, you don't actually know what impact that book's had on anybody, what impact your poems have had on anybody. But when you read to a live audience, well, I've often found that people come up to you afterwards and said, "Oh, I really loved that poem you did about whatever." And or people will say, "Yeah, that was a brilliant poem you did there, Dave." Sometimes I say nothing, of course, but it's getting that kind of feedback which really makes you feel that your writing is worthwhile.
Yeah, that
what do you feel about?
I was just going to say, it makes you feel that you've hit a nerve somewhere.
Yeah.
Which is what you're aiming to do. And if people say, you know, they like that, or it moved them somehow, or sometimes people say that I made them cry. I try to make people laugh. I'm not very good at that bit.
Yeah, I think poetry is very much about emotional response. I mean, even if you read a poem on the page, you often have a very visceral response to a poem, and you say, you can really relate to it. People use that expression, I can really relate to that poem. And so it is very much about emotion. I mean, for other people, it will be intellect, but for most people, I would say poetry is about emotion. And if you write and read out poetry on specific subjects, be it happiness, depression, any other number of things, and your audience can relate to it, that's a plus. That's an achievement.
Yeah. You're much better at making people laugh than I am, though.
No comment.
I will say, just so people who are watching us know what we're talking about, I do most of the organisation for our event, and Dave is the MC. So he does all the links and the chat in between the readers, and he's much better at that than I am. One of the things that I think is really important about live events, and events that are on live on Zoom or whatever at the moment, that aren't actually live in person, is the way I write very much with sound in mind. And you know, people have to make that up for themselves when they're reading on the page or in a book. But if I'm reading out, I can make what I want of the sound of that poem. And I actually do, when I'm writing, I'm always reading it out loud here in my kitchen usually. So
and there are some
important to me.
Yeah, I was going to say there are some people who say that even if you're reading a poem off the page, you should actually be reading it aloud to yourself, even if you're in solitude in your own home, reading a book of poetry, you should be reading them aloud, because then you will get more from the poem.
Didn't you put that on the back of one of your books?
Yeah, my latest book, yeah.
You said something about it should be read aloud.
Yeah, well, yeah, my book's called Plain Song from the Backstreets of Silence, so I'm suggesting people disturb the silence, but just for a little while, by reading the poems aloud. Because, yeah, for that very reason that you've mentioned, that, you know, we're often writing, and originally poetry was very much, what's the word? Here we are. I'm going to stumble and pause for a moment because I can't think of the word, even though it's just about passion for words. It wasn't a page craft originally, of course. It was delivered live. The old bards of Wales were delivering live poetry, if you like, never written down on the page. Bit like traditional folk song, passed from one person to another, but never written down. And yeah, forgotten what I was actually saying at the beginning now, as usual.
No, well, that's a point in itself. So, you know, that's fine. So, do we want to say anything else about, before we move on to some other subject, about spoken word events?
Well, I think you did a little survey of our own Cellar Bard audience, didn't you? And
yeah, I did.
You wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, you're quite right. I'd completely forgotten it, but I do have a piece of paper here with some of that on it. Yeah, we were asked by Literature Wales, who part fund our guests, that we try to have a guest nearly every month, guest reader, as well as open mic, and the guest fees are part funded by Literature Wales, and we were asked to contribute towards their annual report this year, and say something about how our event helps people to progress their work, basically, or does it encourage them? So I put this out on our Facebook page, which is, if you want to look us up, the Cellar Bards on Facebook, and how the scheme actually helps us. And I asked people to say something about it, and we've got all sorts of wonderful comments back from people saying things like this: having a guest poet affords Cellar Bards a connection with the wider world of poetry. So when you come to perform, you feel engaged with that wider world. I'm often inspired to write because Cellar Bards Night is coming up, so it connects, coheres, and aids composition. That was one of our regulars, who's a wonderful reader. That's one of Ted's comments. There's plenty more like that. They're all very similar, really. Cellar Bards was only the second place I've ever read, and it was lovely to have encouragement and to hear other poets, readers, musicians perform. It has been inspiring and has helped my confidence enormously. I won't read them all because they're saying very much the same thing in different ways.
Yeah, I was going to say that is a really important point, actually, about spoken word events, because all the ones I've been to are very inclusive. They're very, you know, you don't, if you're a first-time poet or a Poems and Pints virgin, as Dominic likes to call them, you know, you don't get a bad time. You don't get heckled. You know, you're given a warm welcome. People are understanding, and so we're creating, and certainly with the Cellar Bards, we're trying to create an environment in which anybody could come for the very first time, never having read in public before, and not feel too nervous. We do get people who say, I've never read before and I'm really nervous, and they usually deliver a really, really good poem and well delivered. So that's a really important aspect of spoken word events, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it is. Encouraging people come back and develop, and as Ted says, it encourages them to write. I'm one of those people. I mean, I started writing about 8 years ago and went to the Cellar Bards very early on in that new writing career, and started reading there, and it encouraged me to read, and it was a very welcoming, non-judgmental environment in which to begin something. Then it's certainly helped me develop. I've got 2 books out now, and I'll read almost anywhere.
It's a warm, friendly atmosphere, and as I was saying earlier, it's so encouraging of your own work. I mean, I'm a person who basically lacks confidence, and I certainly did with my poetry. When I first started reading in public, I was shaking like a leaf. Now people think I'm the supreme confident person, but the point was, people would come up to me afterwards and saying, Dave, that was brilliant. I just loved the way you delivered that poem, or I loved the poem itself. And that is just so encouraging. You want to do more, because for me personally, I get a buzz out of
there's a
reading
buzz in
poetry
it, isn't
live.
there? Yeah, there is.
Yeah, there's
Definitely
a buzz in it.
I don't get the same buzz when I'm on a Zoom event reading.
No.
But
Well, I struggle with Zoom.
At the moment, we don't have, here in UK anyway, we don't really have much option about having live events at the moment. And things are getting a little worse just now. So I think it's a way off before we can get back to actual live events. So we've been doing this stuff on Zoom. It's not quite the same for me, but Zoom has other aspects to it, which means we get a wider range of people from all over the world quite often at events. So,
yeah, that is a plus, yeah.
Plus, I've been to book launches and other events and been to on Zoom. In the UK, that I wouldn't have got to otherwise. I wouldn't have gone otherwise. And it's a very long way to anywhere from here in West Wales, to be honest. So I was at a couple of launches last week. It was wonderful. And they were in London and Norwich, I think. So anyway, shall we move on to move away from spoken word events? We're not going to talk about that this time, and talk about something else. What should we pick? When did you start writing poetry, Dave?
Well, I started quite young, probably as a 13 or 14-year-old. I guess I was initially writing birthday card greetings, in the usual style, of course, but with my own angle on it, to my mother. I'd write a verse in there for my mother. Wow. And also, I'd only found out recently, having found some papers just after my mother died, that I wrote bits of humorous verse on little scraps of paper, which my mum had kept. And I hadn't quite realized that I was writing slightly bizarre, what you might even call Spike Milligan-esque style poems, even at that very early age. And then from about the age of 17, I had a real conscience about inequality in the world, injustice, that sort of thing. And I was starting to write those kind of poems then at that point. So that's what started me off. How about yourself?
You said earlier it was about 35 years before you shared any of that.
Yeah, well, yeah. This is. I'm the classic introverted, solitary poet, who never shows his work to anybody. Well, not anymore, of course. But that was the case until, well, it was in the early 80s. I wrote a humorous poem about feminism, and I read it out in a pub in Somerset. I belonged to a poetry group in Somerset in the early 80s. And people were just saying, "Wow, that was amazing!" I thought, well, perhaps I could do this again. What's greater than entertaining an audience and getting a laugh? It's and so and then, as I said earlier, Poems and Pints at the Queen's from 2010, when Anthony Jones first got in touch with me. Well, I got in touch with him and said, "What's going on?" He said, "Oh, come along," And he was also very, very encouraging of me personally. Always very positive. So that gave me a lot more encouragement.
Bless him.
What about yourself? When did you start writing, Jackie?
Well, I in recent times I didn't really start writing poetry until about 8 years ago, when I finished my career really as a journalist, because while I was doing journalism, I didn't feel able to write this sort of creative work. It was impossible working with words all day, and then just you're a gardener, you can think about stuff while you're planting trees or whatever you're doing. Absolutely. When you're working as a journalist all day, you don't want to come home and still sit in front of a screen or sit there working. Yeah. So
tap on the typewriter even longer.
I really started writing seriously, properly, although I did write in my early teens before I started work. I actually came second in a poetry competition in my hometown when I was 13. I think we were put in by the schools. I regret to this day that I don't have that poem now. I know it was about fire, and it was quite long. I'd probably edit it down if I could see it now. But anyway,
were you writing at that age other poetry besides the one that you entered for the competition?
I did. I wrote a lot of teenage rubbish through my teens, some of which I still have, and I think there's one poem out of all that I've kept going and still revise sometimes after all these years.
So when you finished your journalistic career, what was it that prompted you to write poetry? Did you always have that desire somewhere lurking to write poetry?
It wasn't to write poetry. I just wanted to have a more creative life and write more creatively. I didn't know what that would be, but it was poetry that started and poetry that came, and that's what I do now. I don't think I've got a novel in me. I've got a few short stories that I wrote actually in my teens or early 20s that I thought were kind of okay, but I've never really developed. So
I mean, bearing in mind the title of this, well, not the title of this specific discussion, but the whole thing is about passion for words. I guess you had a passion for words, even as a journalist. It's a sort, you can have a passion for words. You enjoy writing as a journalist.
And to be honest, I went into journalism because I wanted to write, and it was the only way I could see of actually earning a living out of working with words in some way or another. And there's other aspects to journalism, of course, but that's how it started, and then I just had to continue. It's not a lot of money in poetry, I have to say.
No. It's interesting actually.
Mortgage, put it that way.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've just remembered that before I was even writing poetry, I was writing short stories at the age of 10, even when I was in junior school. So we used to have this lesson called composition, in which obviously you could compose a piece of writing, and I absolutely loved writing short stories. And so yeah, I guess I had this passion for words very early on, but who knows where it comes from. That's something I don't know the answer to.
No, but it's a good thing that you've been able to nurture. I mean, writing nurtures more writing to me. Once you start doing creative work, you do more. It just brings more ideas.
Yeah, and I think also it's actually the reading of poets or novelists or short story writers, which also feeds your own creative impulse, if you like. I mean, that's something we could talk about a little bit, maybe. You know, what kind of influences early on in your poetry writing career, not career, but poetry writing time have either influenced you or sparked you off. You know, what got you going in the reading sense?
Are you asking me that, or shall I?
I'm asking. Yeah, I'm asking you that. Yeah.
Oh dear, that question always we go.
Well, if it'll help, I can answer it first.
Okay, if you want.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing was at some point probably in the early 70s, I guess, roughly, I came across Penguin Modern Poets, and in particular the Liverpool scene, Adrian Henry, Roger McGough and Brian Patton. There was a Penguin Modern Poets issue, publication there, and it was just so exciting, and the poetry was just so exciting, and I thought, blimey, this is poetry, it's amazing. And then there was another Penguin Modern Poets issue was Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso. And I know it's a bit of a cliche to say it blew me mind, but those books did kind of blow my mind, and I thought, good God, this is just, it was so energetic. The poetry was modern, it was energetic, somehow muscular, and it sort of inspired me to write on in some way.
I'm going to put you on the spot here because it's quite difficult in these situations to be well prepared. But I just wonder if you had any examples of that with you.
Not of those two specific, but I was just going to go on to say that even more crucially, in 1976, when I would have been 21. I discovered Seamus Heaney's Death of a Naturalist. It was just lying around. I was living in a kind of semi-commune sort of setup. The book was just lying around, and I picked it up, and I just could not believe. Well, again, to use that dreadful cliche, it blew my mind. I thought, good God, this is just amazing. Because at that time, although I grew up in Manchester, I'm actually a rural person, a country boy, My first 3 years were spent in the wilds of Lincolnshire, where my dad was a farm worker, and I was rediscovering all that because I was now living in North Devon on a farm, and I could relate to all that stuff that Heaney was talking about. And I would like to read a poem from there.
Yeah, go.
And it's not, a few poems in that book have been anthologized, but I'm choosing a poem here, which I'm not aware whether it's been anthologized or not, but I think it's highly unlikely, and it's really interesting, and it's very much about rural life on a farm, and this is called The Early Purges. I was 6 when I first saw kittens drown. Dan Taggart pitched them, the scraggy wee shits, into a bucket. A frail metal sound, soft paws scraping like mad. But their tiny din was soon soused. They were slung on the snout of the pump, and the water pumped in. Sure, isn't it better for them now? Dan said. Like wet gloves, they bobbed and shone till he sluiced them out on the dunghill, glossy and dead. Suddenly frightened, for days I sadly hung round the yard, watching the 3 sogged remains turn mealy and crisp as old summer dung, until I forgot them. But the fear came back when Dan trapped big rats, snared rabbits, shot crows, or with a sickening tug pulled old hens' necks. Still, living displaces false sentiments, and now, when shrill pups are prodded to drown, I just shrug, bloody pups. It makes sense. Prevention of cruelty talk cuts ice in town, where they consider death unnatural. But on well-run farms, pests have to be kept down. I mean, what was astonishing for me was in Heaney's book there was he was writing about blackberries, he was writing about rats, he was writing about bulls being taken to the cow for serving. All that kind of stuff was going on in my own life at the time, and so I could very much relate to it, which again, as I said earlier, is a lot about what poetry is doing. It's something you can relate to, a subject you relate to. And I later on I found...
So brilliantly.
Pardon?
He does it so brilliantly.
He does it so brilliantly, and I was going to say later on, I came across other poets like Robert Frost and Wendell Berry, who were also farming or doing living rural lives and writing about it. So for example, in Frost, you've got apple picking going on, or it's just something I could relate to, and I just it all kind of gelled beautifully in my life. I was living a rural life, and I was reading rural poetry.
I've actually got a Heaney poem here that I thought I might refer to at some point. It's been quite difficult because I've got a random selection of books and things here to draw on if something sort of kicks off about something. But I mean, Heaney is inspirational to me as well. Although I'd like to talk a bit later about some more Welsh poets rather than, but I'll get to that. There's a poem by Heaney that always resonates with me because it's about catching the moment, or not being able to catch the moment, but he does. And to me, it's partly about it relates to me about writing poetry as well. And it's a lot of people will know this one. It's Postscript. It's a sonnet. I'll just read it. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones the surface of a slate grey lake is lit by the earth lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park or capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways, and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. Oh.
Yeah. The earthed lightning of a flock of swans. I mean, isn't that a wonderful line? You know, it's
he's got so many, hasn't he? No wonder
he has.
Inspired by him. We're talking about poetry we love, and that maybe has some influence on us. So I'm going to read a couple of poems in a minute by, well, I won't say by who, by some contemporary poets that I like. Dave's going to finish with something from Dylan Thomas. But first, I think Dave wants to say something about some influences on him and to read a piece for us. So Dave.
Yes, well, I'd like to say about influence, for one thing, that we don't necessarily always know our own influences. So things may be going on subconsciously, seeping into our brain. As the Scottish folk singer Dick Gaughan once said, I learned this song by osmosis. And that leads me on to say that I feel I'm probably influenced by traditional folk song and probably the acoustic bluesmen, who I used to listen to a lot of blues. So that was also an impact. And having grown up in the sort of 60s and early 70s as a young person, which is a time when you're kind of very much absorbing all kinds of things, words in all kinds of forms, I feel that people like Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, certainly Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, Joan Armatrading, all these kind of people, Van Morrison, all the so-called singer-songwriters of that era must have had an impact on me. And I'm not forgetting, of course, the Beatles. I mean, I used to know and sing just about every single Beatles song. I knew them all inside out. And so they must have seeped into my brain and therefore come out in my poetry somehow or other, in unobvious ways, quite possibly. Now, of course, the number one, well, not the number one influence, but an influence is obviously the great bard himself, William Shakespeare. And I'd just like to illustrate something here in that Shakespeare uses poetic language to make the most simple of statements. So, for example, in this example, Hamlet, in the play of the same name, doesn't say, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, I'm feeling really depressed today. Life seems really futile. No, he doesn't say that at all. He says, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercise. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave or hanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why, it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? No man delights, not me, nor woman neither. So there we are. That's Shakespeare elaborating somewhat on the simple statement, I'm feeling a bit depressed. Not quite so good as Richard Burton, who has also recited those lines, but I'm working on it. Anyway,
you do very well. Did you do that from memory?
Oh, absolutely from memory. Yes, I love to. As you know,
whether you're reading or not, you see. But I thought you weren't.
No. As you know, I love to recite some Shakespeare, including some sonnets now and again. Anyway, Jackie, what about your influences? Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about that.
Difficult question, this influences thing, isn't it? I like your idea of osmosis very much, because we read widely and we listen a lot to other people, and things do come in. I was going to read 3 very short poems from 3 different poets, contemporary poets, well, 2 of them are contemporaries, who I would say do influence me, but who I love to read and I love their work, and I'm sure whether it actually directly influences me or not, there's some osmosis certainly going on here that you speak about. So the first one I'm going to read is by Julian Clark, which is in her book Zoology, which, strangely enough, both of us have a copy of this. I know we usually try to buy when we buy new poetry collections, we, Dave, you're going up and down, you're right.
Yeah, I'm just going up and down. I wanted to show off my shirt again. Sorry about that. Carry on. Carry on, Jackie. Don't be deterred.
Okay. Okay. It's really weird. Sorry about that, guys. That when we buy new poetry collections, we tend to buy one copy. One of us will buy it, and then we lend it to the other, and it spends a little time in each of our houses. This one, we bought one copy each because we had to both have it at the time. So there we are. So two very short ones from Gillian. This is Spring. After frozen ground, a loosening. After silence, birdsong, a beginning. Earth's skin pricks with growth. Snows melt and flow, filling streams, falls, rivers, streaking the slopes. A wing of light spreads, rises up the mountain slopes, fields flood with green. There's a wonderful rhyme there, which is quite unusual to me at the beginning, because if you read Spring, which is the title, and the end of the first line is loosening, it makes a rhyme as you read. And that says quite a lot about Gillian's poetry to me, because she's very much a person who writes with sound in mind, which is, I think, why I like her so much, because that's what I try to do. I think we mentioned that earlier. And the second of her poems, which is on the same kind of subject, really, it's only 4 lines, is September. It's only 4 lines because I'm missing out 2 lines of Welsh, which I'm going to find really difficult to read, or difficult to read well. So I'm going to read the 4. September. The cycle begins again. The weather turns. The winds Atlantic. Song of the mountains, drumbeat in the air, on the track. That's it. That's so small. The 2 lines of Welsh were exactly the same as the last 2 lines that I read in English. So I haven't missed any meaning in the sense of content in that way. I'm sorry about not being able to read that. So something else. Sorry,
I'll just say I'd agree completely about your well, not the influence necessarily, but liking of Julian Clark's work. I mean, I mentioned earlier on in the conversation about me liking rural poets like Robert Frost and Seamus Heaney, Wendell Berry and so on, and I'd put her in that category. She's very much a rural poet, but as you say, quite rightly say, she's writing about, she's writing from a point of view of sound and how the poems sound.
Much of her work certainly does, yeah. I was going to also read something from another poet that I like very much, Alice Oswald, and this is in Woods, etc. I've chosen quite a short poem because I don't want to spend loads of time reading long ones, but this says it all in quite a few words too, I think. This is River. In the black gland of the earth, the tiny inkling of a river. Put your ear to the river, you hear trees. Put your ear to the trees, you hear the widening numerical workings of the river, right down the length of Devon. Under a milky square of light that keeps quite still, the river slows down and goes on, with storm trash clustered in its branches, and paper unfolding underwater, and pairs of ducks swimming over bright grass among flooded willows. The earth's eye, looking through the earth's bones, carries the moon, carries the sun, but keeps nothing. So thank you to Alice.
Yeah.
That first line again, first line, in the black gland of earth, the source of the river. Wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what all poets aspire to, or should aspire to, perhaps, is to say as much as possible in as few words as possible. Yeah. Especially in this in this time of, you know, short attention spans and so many impacts on our own time. You know, we need to be saying, as you know, getting things out there in as few words as possible.
Exactly, and I think that is what I aspire to. Except occasionally, I like to do a long, rambly one. But
oh, me too. Me too.
As you know,
yes, indeed. I've done a few long ones. I've bored a few people, you know, with my poetry.
No, not at all. I think Julian Clark wouldn't mind me saying this, but she is most definitely she's a huge fan of R.S. Thomas, and she is. I see echoes of his work in her work. I think she's most definitely, certainly inspired by him, if not influenced.
Influence for sure. I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there are echoes there. So I thought I'd just read one little. Oh, you can't read that. Too light. This is from R.S. Thomas, Poems to Elsie. I read another example of how to capture. Well, this is 50 years in a few lines, really. It's one of my favourite poems of all time, not just of his, but of anyone's. This is A Marriage. We met under a shower of bird notes. 50 years passed. Love's moment in a world in servitude to time. She was young. I kissed with my eyes closed and opened them on her wrinkles. Come, said Death, choosing her as his partner for the last dance. And she, who in life had done everything with a bird's grace, opened her bill now for the shedding of one sigh, no heavier than a feather. I just love that. When I read that for the first time, well, it actually did inspire me to write a poem, which I'm not going to read now, which was called A Kiss, which is not nearly as good as him, but inspiring nonetheless, and it makes us want to write more.
Yeah, I mean, that is another good example there of somebody writing in very few lines, really, the big subjects, time and death in particular. You know, just brilliantly done, isn't it? I mean, he's again a master, R.S. Thomas. Yeah, absolute master.
It certainly is. I mean, the personal becomes universal in some of these poems, and that's, to me, is a thing to aspire to. We can. I think that's all I want to say on my influences. I mean, there's plenty of other people I could mention, but it would be kind of what we have time for at the moment is a list. I don't need to go into all that now. So you want to end this whole section with some Dylan Thomas, I think.
Yes, I think it's so important. As I said before, it's so important. You cannot escape the echoes of Dylan Thomas when you live in southwest Wales, and in fact I live literally 20 minutes or so drive from Larne. So I'm going to attempt to recite. I may have to refer to the book because I'm struggling with memory these days, and I actually read Fern Hill about almost a year ago in the Cellar Bards, when we had some of our Irish friends and possibly Swedish friends there as part of the festival. But I've had to relearn it because it is not an easy poem to recite from memory, and I just particularly love the way that Dylan Thomas has interwoven through all the stanzas certain words like sun, moon, time, green, golden, but he uses them in slightly different ways in each stanza, and so it's very much about the sound. It's a very structurally tight poem, but you wouldn't necessarily know that. I had to study that for myself and work out he's using particular numbers of lines in each stanza, a particular number of syllables in each line. But this won't come through but necessarily in the sound of it, but I would suggest that people concentrate on the sound of the poem. Fern Hill. Now, as I was young and easy under the apple boughs about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns. And once below a time, I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman. The calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hayfields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air and playing, lovely and watery, and fire green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars, as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the nightjars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awaken the farm like a wanderer white with the dew come back, the cock on his shoulder, it was all shining, it was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light, in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house, under the new-made clouds, as happy as the heart was long, in the sun that is born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house-high hay, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trades that time allows in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs before the children, green and golden, follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, and I sang in my chains like the sea. I did it, but I may have got one word wrong, I think. But anyway,
well done.
There we are.
Very well done. You weren't
Got to
reading.
keep working on it.
You were
It
not
flowed.
reading that.
No, that was a recital from memory, my failing memory. But it has to be worked on virtually every day to get that to flow. And,
well, very well done. I just wanted to make sure that the people who are watching this realised that you'd actually recited it all.
As you know, I love to recite, like Shakespeare and Dylan Thomas and many other poets, and I think that does emphasise the sound of poetry. That helps to. You're not looking at words on a page. You're not looking at black on white. You're just literally hearing the sound.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I wish I could learn that. I think not. Never mind. You did incredibly well, and the Shakespeare as well was from memory too. That's about it, I think. I hope everyone, well, we both hope that everyone has enjoyed listening to our rather rambling tour through our passion for words with us, but it was a bit rambly, but we hope you enjoyed. Thank you for
One needs to ramble sometimes.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Lots of poets ramble, but and I think Dylan Thomas rambles to some degree, even though his poems are often very tight. But he rambles in a most beautifully poetic way, doesn't he?
Yes, well, I hope we did a bit of that. There we are. Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr.